El Salvador. You look at it on a map, and, well, it's the smallest country in Central America.
It really is tiny on the map.
But as your sources show, it's historically been the most densely populated. And the level of violence it's seen, it's just immense. I mean, a civil war that killed 75,000 people.
That number alone, 75,000, mostly civilians, your sources stress. It just hits you, tells you right away, this is a nation with a really complex, often tragic past.
Absolutely. So welcome to the deep dive. We've gone through that stack of sources you sent us, the articles, the research, your notes, and we're going to really dive into El Salvador today.
Yep, pulling out those key knowledge nuggets, the crucial insights.
Our goal is to help you quickly get a handle on this nation,
Yeah.
understand the key forces that shaped it.
From its really deep ancient past, through colonization, all those cycles of conflict and inequality, right up to the challenges it faces now. And your sources, they cover a lot. History, civil war, economy, social issues, politics. It gives us a pretty full picture.
So let's try and unpack this. I mean, what does it really mean for a country this size to face such huge issues? Civil war, horrific gang violence, that persistent grinding poverty, mass migration. Where do we even start?
Well, your sources suggest we need to go right back. Way back, actually, before the Spanish even arrived, the pre-Columbian era.
Okay, how far back are we talking?
Some research indicates human presence may be as far back as 10,000 BC.
Wow, okay, that's deep history.
It is. And then, by around 3,500 BC, we see settled agricultural communities developing. Sites like Los Naranjos in the west are mentioned.
And there were influences from other major cultures.
Definitely. Both Maya and Nahuatl cultures left their mark, and agriculture was key.
Right, the sources mentioned maize and cacao being really important.
So important that the area apparently got called the granary of the Maya. And even back then, you see early signs of, social structure, stratification even, in things like burial sites.
So established communities, farming, social layers. Then what?
Then the Spanish arrived. Pedro de Alvarado, he led the first major conquest expedition in 1525. Your sources, they don't mince words about these first explorers.
No, what do they say?
Descriptions of cruelty, ambition. One source even compares their lack of faithfulness unfavorably to some indigenous groups.
So it wasn't exactly a gentle meeting of cultures.
Not at all. The orders were clear. Establish towns, convert the natives. But the sources say early colonization attempts were tough. Often failed, actually.
Really? Why?
Well, there was significant resistance, conflicts like the revolt in the Osapa valleys, and figures like Gonzalo de Salazar are mentioned for actively fostering this bitter hatred, which, sadly, the sources say lasted generations.
It's interesting, though, that even among the Spanish, some question the methods. You mentioned Franciscan friars.
Yes, Martí Castañeda and Juan de la Cruz. Your sources highlight them spending months arguing about the injustice of forcing natives into servitude. So not everyone was on board with the cruelty.
That adds a bit of nuance.
It does. But despite the difficulties and some internal dissent, the Spanish eventually established control. Partly, it seems, by taking over or adapting the rudimentary towns and structures that were already there.
Okay, let's jump forward quite a bit. Past the whole colonial period to 1821, independence from Spain.
Right. The Deed of Independence is signed.
What was the initial idea then? Were they going it alone?
Not quite. The first vision was bigger, a Central American Confederation, a united region.
But that didn't stick, did it?
No, it fell apart pretty quickly. Costa Rica bailed early. There was a Central American Federal Republic around 1823 with a constitution, separation of powers. Maybe the closest they got to a real parliamentary system, but yeah, short-lived.
And the period right after independence,
Yeah.
Your sources described it using pretty strong language. Horror.
That's the word they use. Burning towns, massacres. It sounds like absolute chaos. The sources talk about incredible cruelty by unpaid soldiers just barging into homes, killing on suspicion.
And specific figures are mentioned, like Serrano, who seemed bent on destruction.
Yes. And you also see this fraternal hatred developing, conflicts between the newly independent states themselves, like Guatemala and El Salvador fighting each other.
What a mess.
Totally. And this chaos led to early governments that, while maybe natural in forming, were described as recruiting whites, organizing armies, and crushing other races, leaving indigenous people homeless.
So right from the start of independence, you have this pattern emerging. Violence, inequality.
Absolutely. A really difficult foundation. And El Salvador, compared to some neighbors, didn't have vast resources. So the economy came to rely heavily on coffee plantations.
Coffee? Yeah, that sounds like it could bring money in.
It did bring economic growth, yes, and this is a huge, but in your sources, it created this deep societal flaw. Wealth got incredibly concentrated.
In the hands of a few, right? The
Yeah.
coffee oligarchy.
Exactly. So you had that post-independence inequality, and now coffee wealth just makes it way worse, concentrated in this tiny elite.
Sounds like you're building up pressure.
That's what the sources call it, a socioeconomic pressure cooker. And things like the Great Depression in the 1930s, they just blew the lid off, widened the gaps, intensified the poverty and subjugation, which naturally led to peasants demanding change.
And how did the elite-controlled government react to people asking for reforms?
With violence, brutal repression. That includes the horrific event known as La Matanza in 1932.
La Matanza.
Yeah.
The slaughter. That sounds chilling.
It was a devastating crackdown on peasant uprisings and calls for basic fairness.
And this repression wasn't just a one-off.
No, the pattern continued. As the economy modernized a bit, people moved into industrial jobs, but the government remained deeply hostile to any kind of popular organization. Literacy campaigns, strikes, civil rights groups, all viewed with suspicion.
The student movement in the 70s too, right? Fiercely repressed.
Yes, that's highlighted. And the oligarchy pushed propaganda, labeling any movement for change as foreign, communist-inspired, an excuse for extreme brutality. By the 70s, both national and international groups were documenting massive human rights abuses by the state.
And all this build-up, this constant repression, it leads directly into the Civil War.
That's the explicit link your sources make. The official start is often pegged to a coup in 1979, but the fighting, the state violence, it had been escalating for a long time.
So the war's roots are deep.
Very deep. Societal injustice, that massive rich-poor gap, the repressive state, poverty, corruption, it all fueled the guerrilla movements. One source mentions a detailed study showing just how bad the state repression was before '79.
And in the midst of this rising tension, a key figure emerges, Monsignor Oscar Romero.
Yes, he became Archbishop in 1977. Quickly known as the voice of the voiceless, he wasn't afraid to use his platform.
How so?
He directly challenged the leaders, spoke out against the violence, questioned the whole authoritarian system. He was incredibly brave, incredibly important at that time.
Given that buildup, it's maybe not surprising, but the actual Civil War, the violence was just on another level.
Truly staggering. 75,000 victims. And your sources make a crucial point. The vast majority were civilians, not combatants.
There's a statistic mentioned, right? A really stark one.
Yeah, it's horrific. For every one soldier killed in the fighting, the government forces killed 20 civilians.
20 civilians for every soldier.
It speaks volumes. And it wasn't just collateral damage, often extrajudicial killings. The aim, according to the sources, was terror, to crush support for the guerrillas by brutalizing the population.
And during this time, the United States got heavily involved.
Definitely a significant role, and a controversial one, according to your sources. Just weeks after that 1979 coup, CIA operatives were on the ground.
Why so quickly?
Part of the context given is that this was seen as a way to push back against State Department and congressional policies that had actually cut military aid because of earlier killings.
So internal U.S. divisions playing out in El Salvador.
Seems like it. An effort to restart covert action, lobby for U.S. funds, get training going again for the Salvadoran security forces.
And the justification.
Well, one former ambassador quoted described the Salvadoran left as a virulently anti-American enemy. That kind of perspective drove the policy.
And it worked. Did the aid resume?
Yes. Military assistance started flowing again. A massive amount of military equipment. One figure in your sources apparently called this support like gold. Clearly, that external aid fueled the conflict significantly.
So after all those years of terrible war, finally, the peace accords.
Signed January 16, 1992, it took over 2 years of really intense negotiations.
Who were the key players in getting that deal done?
The UN was central, led by Alvaro de Soto. Then you had the Salvadoran government under President Cristiani and the guerrilla leadership, figures like Joaquin Villalobos representing the FMLN.
And what was in the accords? What did they promise?
It was comprehensive. Provisions for demilitarizing, integrating former fighters, strengthening democracy, social development programs, all overseen by international verification.
Sounds like a real turning point, a moment of hope.
Definitely hope. A feeling that maybe, finally, the long rule of those powerful families was ending. They even included civilian representatives on Truth Commission.
But your sources suggest it wasn't a smooth transition. There was apprehension, too.
Yes, the hope was tinged with worry. And challenges popped up almost immediately. Big debates over amnesty laws, for instance.
Right. How do you deal with past atrocities? accountability.
Exactly. Difficult cases like the Santos Ocoto massacre, the trial of Colonel Benavides, these were huge tests. And the sources talk about silent strategies and vengeance politics, often letting perpetrators walk free.
And did the violence just stop overnight?
Not entirely. State violence did reemerge, particularly in crackdowns on emerging gangs under the Arena government that came in after the Accords.
So that initial promise of democratization, it started to wobble.
It faced real headwinds. Economic instability didn't help. Then the explosion of gang violence, MS-13, M-18 are mentioned in your intro source. The continued influence of elites, governance failures, it all put pressure on that fragile piece.
Let's talk about the economy after the war.
Yeah.
In the 90s. What was the strategy?
A big shift. A real focus on maquilas, those export assembly plants.
What?
Targeting female labor.
Okay. What else?
Privatizations, a lot of them. Banking, energy, communications. Major state assets were sold off. The state lost a lot of control there.
And then there's this other huge economic factor that emerges tied to people leaving the country.
Remittances. This is absolutely critical, and your sources really emphasize it. As more Salvadorans emigrated, especially to the U.S., they started sending money back home.
How much money are we talking?
A lot. The sources give figures like $1.2 billion in the late 90s, jumping to maybe $3 billion by 2006.
$3 billion a year. That's enormous for a small country.
It became a fundamental lifeline, paying for food, housing, school fees, healthcare. International financial bodies actually saw remittances as key to maybe overcoming the country's economic struggles.
It's ironic, though, your sources mention that these immigrants who are propping up the economy often face stigma, right? Called illegal or mojado.
Yes, that contrast is pointed out. They're economic heroes in one sense, but still face prejudice. And another big economic move mentioned is dollarization around the early 2000s.
Adopting the U.S. dollar.
Why? Partly, the sources suggest, to guarantee profits for businesses against potential currency devaluation.
Okay, so you have this massive influx of remittance money, but your sources say deep social problems didn't just disappear.
Far from it. Deep-seated poverty remains a huge issue. One source mentions about a third of the population in extreme poverty.
Still, even with the remittances.
Yes.
Yeah.
And access to basic services like health and education is still inadequate, especially if you're poor or live in a rural area. High child mortality rates persist. Historical gender gaps in education. These are ongoing struggles.
And human rights concerns continue as well.
They do. Abuses against children, trafficking, gang recruitment are highlighted. Human rights defenders themselves can be at risk. And corruption in the police and courts makes tackling organized crime really difficult. The sources keep coming back to it. That huge gap between rich and poor is a root cause of so much violence and insecurity.
What about the healthcare system specifically? How does it function?
It's described as this awkward mix, an amalgamation of three competing paradigms. You've got a public system aiming for universal access, but it's severely underfunded. Then there's a private sector for those who can pay, and an informal sector, often low quality, filling the gaps.
That sounds incredibly unequal just by design.
It leads to huge inequities. Poor people have much worse health outcomes, higher mortality rates. They live in what one source calls a disease shadow, where basic care is out of reach. There's a really poignant line about the population being used to being lied to about promises of universal health care.
Shifting focus a bit, what about environmental issues?
Your sources point to major pressures there, mainly from poor planning and control of development.
Like what specifically?
Rampant urban sprawl, especially around cities. High rates of deforestation, water and air pollution are serious problems too.
So unplanned growth is causing damage.
Yes, chaotic land use, poor management of natural resources. It all adds up and degrades the quality of life for many people.
And El Salvador's geography makes it vulnerable in other ways too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's in a really active zone, highly vulnerable to earthquakes, tropical storms, volcanoes.
We saw that with the 2001 earthquake.
Exactly. Two big ones back-to-back, 7.6 and 6.6 magnitude, caused massive damage, landslides. The soil conditions made it worse.
And storms.
Big risk there, too. A hurricane near the border later in 2001 triggered huge landslides, many deaths. And volcanoes are an ever-present threat. Sources mention over 2 million people live near major ones like San Vicente, San Miguel, San Salvador, Santa Ana.
With all that, the economic hardship, the violence, the environmental risks, it makes sense that migration is such a dominant theme.
It really is. Huge numbers of Salvadorans have left, especially for the U.S.
Mm.
There's growing research interest in this diaspora, partly because of things like deportations and how gang violence continues to push people out.
What does the research tell us so far?
There's quite a bit documenting the earlier waves, like in the 80s and 90s during the war, how communities formed abroad, how they stayed connected to issues back home, like social justice, even using art like graffiti to process trauma.
But there are still things we don't fully understand.
Yes, your sources identify gaps. Less research on migration after the peace accords. The dangerous journey many make undocumented through Mexico. And exactly how the diaspora organizes itself now to maintain ties and send back all those vital remittances.
Okay, moving from people flow to technology flow. Your sources say El Salvador lags there.
Right. Technological development is called incipient. Not just El Salvador, but Central America generally lagging behind other regions. There's talk of an innovation gap.
Especially for smaller businesses.
Yes, particularly small firms and in rural areas. Limited skills, contacts, funding. It holds them back. The economy is still very focused on that low-tech assembly, the maquilas.
And no big push for tech innovation from the government.
Apparently not a coordinated national program focused on it, according to your sources.
Politically, though, the early 2000s brought a major change, didn't they?
A huge one. In 2009, the FMLN, the party that grew out of the former guerrilla movement, actually won the presidency. They defeated ARENA, the right-wing party that had ruled for so long.
And it was peaceful.
Yes, a peaceful election, a peaceful transfer of power. Your sources call it a historic first for the country. A really significant moment.
So, a time of political hope again.
It certainly seemed that way, but
Yeah.
your sources also describe a lot of disappointment with the next FMLN government, the one elected in 2014, called Uninspired, a return to old ways.
Really? How so?
One source uses the term pact of failures, suggesting it involved the same actors in the same pact, so a feeling of stagnation, maybe.
So, political divisions remain strong.
Definitely. But public anger, according to the sources, started to shift its focus, not just aimed at gangs anymore, but increasingly at the major actors.
Who are they targeting?
Millionaires, established right-wing parties, the Attorney General's office, even the armed forces came under scrutiny, a growing demand for accountability from the top.
Interesting. And the U.S. role is mentioned again here.
Yes, touching on the outsized position of the United States and this idea that the U.S. should set the agenda, but also empower Salvadorans. And that 2009 election victory, it's linked back to years of civil society groups mobilizing, demanding alternatives.
Amidst all these immense challenges, the legacy of violence, inequality, politics, environment, your sources end by highlighting something else. The energy of young people.
They do. Gang violence has hit youth incredibly hard. San Salvador being called one of the most dangerous capitals. It creates fear, isolation for young people.
But they're not just victims, they're acting.
Exactly. That pressure has also sparked youth action. Coalitions forming, groups mentioned like the Dream Team, working on health, education, jobs, violence prevention. They have ideas, a vision.
And it's crucial the vision is heard.
Absolutely. The sources stress the need for the government to genuinely engage with them, not just institutional talks, but real participation in shaping policy, giving them a real seat at the table.
So we've really covered a lot of ground. Centuries of history, these cycles of violence and inequality, the economic shifts from coffee to reliance on remittances, the deep social and environmental issues, the political ups and downs, and finally, the resilience and energy of the people, especially the youth.
You've definitely gone deep into the complex reality of El Salvador, pulling these threads together from your sources. You can see how those historical power dynamics, the external influences, the internal conflicts, how they all weave together to create the present situation.
What really strikes me, thinking about all this, is you have these incredibly deep-rooted challenges going back centuries, shaped by power, by outside sources. And then you have this clear vision for change coming from civil society, from young people. So the provocative thought is, what will it actually take for that energy, that vision, to translate into real sustained progress? How can El Salvador finally break free from these cycles of poverty and violence that just seem to keep repeating?